Welcome to your next video lecture in our personality unit, Unit 4. Today we are covering modules 4.6a and b, which is going to focus on the social cognitive and the trait perspectives explanation of human personality.
So let's get started with the social cognitive perspective. And the key heavy hitter name behind this is our dear friend Albert Bandura. And if that name sounds familiar, good, because he should. As we know, Albert Bandura is famous for his Bobo doll study on observational learning and how children learn through observing aggressive and non-aggressive models. So a lot of times we put Bandura under the perspective of behavioral, but really Bandura has created his own little niche in the field of psychology and his own little mini perspective, which is called social cognitive, which, as it sounds, is a combination of the sociocultural perspective and the cognitive perspective. So these two things, these two perspective meshes together, looking at how the thoughts and those around us work together in interplay to impact who we are. So Albert Bandura, in the social cognitive perspective, has a theory called reciprocal determinism. And I call this theory the chicken or the egg theory. And that, age-old question, is it the chicken that came first or the egg? Is it the egg that came first or the chicken? What is it that came first? And that's what I think about when I think about reciprocal determinism, because it's that question of what came first? Is it your thoughts that impact your behavior, that causes your environment to act different towards you? Or is it how your environment acts that impacts your thoughts, that makes you behave a certain way? Or is it your behavior that impacts how others treat you, which impacts your thoughts? So Bandura thought that it was kind of this trifecta thing, that our thoughts, our beliefs, our interpretations impact our behavior, how we act, how we communicate with others. And that impacts how our environment reacts and acts to us. So the best way to understand reciprocal determinism, I think, is in example format. So here's an example of Bandura's reciprocal determinism could occur when a child is acting out in school. The child doesn't like going to school. Therefore, he or she acts out in class. So here we have a cognitive. We've got a belief. The child doesn't like school. We've got a behavior. The child is acting out in school. Okay. Continuing on, this results in teachers and administrations of the school dislike having that child around. When confronted by the situation, the child admits that he or she hates school and other peers don't like him or her. So here we then have an environment where other peers are not nice to him or her. This results in the child acting inappropriately, forcing the administrators who dislike him, having him or her around to create a more restrictive environment for children of this stature. So each behavioral, environmental, and I'd even add in cognitive factor coincides together for that child, resulting in a continuous battle on all three levels. So if we go back to this slide, okay, we've got some cognitive factors going on here. This child has a thought pattern believing that school is terrible, that they hate school. Okay, they've got behavior. They're not very motivated. They are probably not very kind. They probably don't do what they're supposed to in classes. Well, then you've got the environmental factors. You've got this really restricted environment that this child is in because they've gotten in so much trouble. You have teachers and peers who are very cautious around this child and perhaps not very kind to that child. So what is it that caused this never-ending circle? Is it the thoughts that cause this circle to start? Is it a negative environment that caused this circle to start? Is it his behavior or her behavior that caused this circle to start? And this is where Bandura thought that it was an interplay of these three things, and that this cycle impacts who we are, that we both motivate and change our environment, and we are also impacted by our environment. And so it's this constant interplay between our thoughts, our behaviors, and in our environment that really impact who we are and the personality that we have today. The final perspective is trait perspective, and I purposely leave trait perspective to last, not only because it's one of the last modules, but because it is very different than the other perspectives, such as the psychoanalytic, the humanistic, and the social cognitive perspective. It's different in that in the trait perspective, the whole job of the trait perspective is to describe human personality. The whole job of the other personality theories is to explain personality. So if you remember back to our other video lectures, all of those video lectures explained why we have the personality traits that we have. The trait perspective does not explain where it comes from, why we have it. It merely describes your personality. And we love the trait perspective. We love taking personality inventories and having somebody tell us about ourselves. Yeah, we do that all the time for fun. At least I do. So, the trait perspective, where did this come from? This came from a guy named Gordon Allport. And Gordon Allport started this trait perspective by looking at all of the words in the English language that could be used to describe a person's personality. And he came up with a whopping 18,000 different words that could be used to describe a person's personality. And he spent his life's work shortening that list by coming up with synonyms, by combining some of those words, and getting that list of 18,000 descriptors down to 4,500 descriptors. That's a pretty big feat. But still, nobody's going to sign up to take a 4,500 question personality test. And it makes it very cumbersome to try and describe personality traits when we are looking at so many different traits. So then came around a man named Raymond Cattell, and Cattell used a method called factor analysis to get that number of 4,500 down to 16. So what factor analysis is factor analysis takes a personality trait and looks at correlated clusters of personality traits. So if we have a person who is outgoing, okay, they then can do research to find out, well, those that are outgoing also tend to be A, B, and C. We see a correlation between those that are outgoing and those that like jokes and those that tend to like to stay up late and those that, I don't know, tend to be outgoing. You know, you look at things that are correlated to that one trait. And so he ended up coming up with 16 correlated clusters where he was able to choose almost 16 different personality traits. And by learning how much or how little of that personality trait an individual has, he could then figure out the correlated clusters of descriptor words that relate to that person. So that's a pretty big accomplishment. Well, continuing down the line in the field of psychology, we have now taken and gone from the 16 personality factors down to what we call the Big Five. And the Big Five is really at the core of the trait perspective, where we have gone from that whopping number of 18,000. We've whittled that number down through using factor analysis and other methods, and we have come down to 5 different personality traits that if we can measure a person on these 5 personality traits, we're able to describe that person using many different correlated clusters of vocabulary terms. So if we can find out how conscientious or non-conscientious a person is, we can also find out some other things about them just by knowing how conscientious they are. And if we can find out how open they are to new experiences or how not open they are to new experiences, we're able to describe a whole bunch of other things about them just by knowing how open they are. So what you do need to know from the Big Five is you need to know all 5 of these core personality traits. It helps to memorize it with the mnemonic device CANOE. Conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness to experience, and extraversion. And so again, we can look at people's personality along those 5 different major personality traits, and by knowing how conscientious or not conscientious they are, we can find out a whole lot more about that person. So in class, we're going to dedicate some time to looking for ourselves as to where we are on these 5 dimensions and what else can we learn about ourselves based on where we're at in those 5 dimensions. So that's what our plan is for when you come back to class. I hope you have a wonderful evening.